is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Can I urge you to put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now, because who knows by the end of this week whether the guest sitting opposite me now, of course the Conservative MP for North East Hammond, key mover of the ERG, and one of my LBC colleagues currently, Jacob Rees-Mogg, will be part of Her Majesty's government. And that has to be my first question. Would you settle for Deputy Prime Minister's Chancellor of the Exchequer for us? And I mean all rolled into one, of course. You have to do all three.
Very, very flattering. Look, I'll do anything to help Boris. I think he's the right answer. I think he'll be a very good Prime Minister. I think he will have the right spirit in getting us out of the European Union and then moving on to the other things that we need to do. So if he wants to be the junior under-minister in Pyongyang, I will happily go off and do it.
But you're likely to be, I know you love your cricket, you're probably going to be somewhere in the batting or bowling lineup, aren't you?
Well, I'm hoping to be at Lord's on Thursday because England are playing their first test against Ireland. It starts on Wednesday.
Right.
And I'm going with various children on Thursday. So
I trust
there's always cricket.
Your own children.
Oh, my own children, yes.
Not just children you pick
and
up.
my wife.
Yes, indeed. Some of Boris's children. We'll park that there. But you would hope to be, if not opening the batting, you'd hope to be somewhere on the order, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, look, I'm happy to be the scorer. I mean, I'm happy to be cheering in the crowd. I think Boris is the right answer. And it's not about me. It's about, do we leave the European Union and do we have a Tory party that can be electable? And that's why I've supported Boris for some time, because it's been clear to me that he has the charisma to do it. And charisma is the stardust of politics. It's difficult to define. It's difficult to pin down. Boris just has it. And other people, almost everyone else doesn't have it.
Let's get to the calls. We'll talk more about the European Union in a moment. Mike is in Ware, in Hertfordshire, the great bed of Ware, as I recall from my history lessons. Mike, go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'd like to ask...
I think, Mike, we're going to move you to another spot, sir, because that was all merely static, like a Dalek. Try again. Andrew is in Harlow. Andrew, you're on the radio. Try again. Jacob Rees-Mogg is waiting. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Yes.
Okay, morning, Jacob. The
morning,
question
Andrew.
I have is, with the ability to probe Parliament now taken off the table by the MPs in Parliament, does that not bring a no-deal Brexit even closer, that we leave with no deal?
Well, I never thought the row about proroguing Parliament was a very serious one. I think the idea that any...
In as much as it would never happen, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Never happened.
Right.
No, Mr. Ferrari, you're quite right, that a democratic country does not simply abandon its Parliament, that you can't do that, that if there's no majority, the default is to have a general election, not simply to suspend Parliament. So although it could have been used tactically to suspend business of Parliament for a couple of days, it could never have been used for 3 months just to stop Parliament sitting. So I'm not worried about the bill that was passed last week. I don't think it has any real effect or doesn't change anything very much.
Doesn't bind Mr. Johnson's hands.
Doesn't bind Mr. Johnson's hands any more than in reality they were bound beforehand.
By the process.
Our constitution runs on conventions, not on specific laws. And good prime ministers always obey the broad conventions because they get into such trouble if they don't, and they lose the support and the goodwill of the electorate, which is ultimately what they depend on. So I'm not worried about the change on prorogation or the attempt to change prorogation. But Andrew's point, does it make leaving without a deal more likely? Leaving without a deal is the default position. And all these people are spouting off saying we can't possibly leave without a deal. They voted for the Withdrawal Act and they voted for the Article 50 Act, both of which have the logical consequence that you leave without a deal if you haven't got a deal. So what the current Chancellor of the Exchequer means when he says this is terrifying and all those sorts of things, I don't know, because he voted for these things.
Quick response from you, Andrew.
Well, that's what I thought. See, I've been trying to work this out. They're trying to say that they want to leave with a deal. We could have used the proroguing of Parliament as a way of saying we're serious about this to the EU 27, which might have forced them to the table. Now we can't do it. The only thing I can see logical is we let the clock run down and we leave with no deal, which is what they're trying to stop. It's crazy.
Andrew, I think you make a very good point. I think if you want a deal, prepare for no deal, and then you may persuade the EU that you're serious and you may get a deal. But that you're quite right, Andrew. If you take away the power of the government to indicate that it's preparing for no deal, makes it less likely that you get a deal that can get through Parliament.
Andrew, thank you. Before I bring Frank in, we learnt over the course of the weekend, or rather yesterday, that Philip Hammond will not be sacked. He will seek to leave the government prior to Boris Johnson if he is successful later this week. How shall we remember Philip Hammond?
He's a very serious-minded individual. He was not in favour of us leaving the European Union and put that through into office in spite of the manifesto commitments, but he is a Conservative, and generally speaking, one shouldn't speak ill of fellow Conservatives. But,
would you like to?
I said yesterday on LBC
I wasn't listening. I was listening a couple of weeks ago when, funnily enough, you were speaking to someone and you sort of suggested something like, well, perhaps Nick Ferrari would seek to do that, and the line dropped off and you said, well, I must never ever take into doubt Mr. Ferrari's virtues or everything like that, and I was actually listening.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, it was the Friday before last. I nearly phoned in.
You should have done. That would have been brilliant.
There is a bug in this studio, by the way, if ever you... Anyway, coming back, what did you say yesterday? Sorry, I was in flight.
I was making some comparison between Mr. Hammond and undertakers, but actually... There's a wonderful undertaker who's a member of my local Conservative association. He's a most cheerful gentleman, Brian Bishop, and varied members of my family going back for decades. Really fine.
I trust they were dead first.
Yeah, indeed. Fine and jovial figure. And compared to that, Mr. Hammond's rather gloomy, so I felt I was being a bit harsh on undertakers.
OK, I'm not going to get any more. I know too well. Frank's in Shipley. Go ahead, Frank. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Frank. You're in Shipley. You're in the great Philip Davis's constituency.
Absolutely, yes. A definite Brexiteer, I think.
Yes.
Now, bearing in mind that Boris needs to unite the Conservative Party, do you think it's got to be a wise move for him to put Jeremy Hunt in the cabinet? I know Jeremy's been a little bit tenuous on his commitment to leave on the 31st of October, but I don't think Boris really needs to snub the Jeremy Hunt supporters. So I think it's got to be a wise move to get Jeremy in there. What do you think?
I'd
Stay on the line.
Turn it round, Frank, that I think that Jeremy Hunt should accept whatever he is offered. That previously Jeremy Hunt has indicated that he will only serve in the highest offices. I think that's a vanity. I think people have to rally round, support the country and the party and accept the new leader, and that grandstanding and saying, well, if I'm not Foreign Secretary, I won't be anything, is not the right approach to take. So my answer to you, Frank, is yes, I absolutely hope that Boris would offer Jeremy Hunt something. I agree that we need to unite the party, but I don't think that Jeremy has a claim to a specific office.
How would you react if he were to stay in post? If Prime Minister Johnson were to say, look, you seem to have done fairly well in that brief, I think you can carry on as Foreign Secretary. Has he been an effective Foreign Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
He's only been a Foreign Secretary for a fairly short space of time. It's bad luck that just as this is all being considered, there is a problem of a very serious kind with Iran, which the Foreign Office must take some responsibility
I've got to get you on that in a moment, by the
for.
way, yeah.
But I think it's too early to say whether Jeremy Hunt would be counted among the greats in that office.
Let's get a reaction quickly on that. Frank, just a reaction from what you've heard from Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Yeah, so I think Jeremy, I didn't realise that he'd sort of imposed criteria on where he should be in the cabinet, but and I think if he does stipulate it's this job or nothing, then I'm afraid Boris has to make that decision.
What's your take on Mr. Hunt in a sentence, Frank, before I move on Jeremy Hunt?
He's managerial, but he's certainly not the right person for the leadership. Right. And just finally, I'd like to see Jacob as the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union if that position continues.
Well, let's put that last to Jacob Rees-Mogg. There's posts coming in for you. Brexit Secretary. What do you say to that?
I'm Frank, that's very generous of you. But as I've said, I'll do anything Boris wants me
to do. Daily Express says Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
There's been a lot of gossip that I read about myself, which is always quite amusing to hear what other people are proposing. What matters is not what Boris thinks.
Right.
And unless he wishes to call in, we won't know.
And another one here, opening bat for Somerset after you were defeated by Kent in the 20 blast. What about that?
Let's not talk about that.
You don't want to talk about Kent beating Somerset. We
don't like that at all.
We go to Twickenham. I do, I was born in Kent. Twickenham, Abby standing by, presumably the constituency of Sir Vince Cable, by the way. Abby, you're on the radio. What's your question? Good morning.
Good morning to you, Boris. I'm grateful to LBC to allow me to ask this question.
Not at all,
My
sir.
question would be, would Mr. Mogg agree, or what would be his thoughts of the policies that is going on against Iran in the Middle East? Should the United Kingdom follow the policies that the Americans have, even though the British ambassador in America just recently has said that, it was a political vandalism which has been done. So I just wonder what would be his thoughts on this subject, please.
Abby, stay on the line. The Iranian crisis and those aspects. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Abby. I think it's an absolutely key question, and I think what has happened has showed that America's been right and the rather softer approach taken by the UK and the EU has been wrong. You can't trust the Iranian regime. It does not abide by the norms of international law. It was gaining revenues from the weakening of sanctions that were done as part of the effort to stop its nuclear program, whilst developing ballistic missiles, simply suspending its uranium enrichment program, but growing the resources to get back to that in the future. I'm afraid I think the Obama agreement was characteristic of Barack Obama. It was well-intentioned but naive, and that Donald Trump is more of a real politician and understands that Iran is one of those countries that is simply hostile to us and is not one that you can do business with. This is not Gorbachev in the late 1980s. This is a really dangerous, unpleasant regime that is hostile to the West.
And a Cobra meeting later today, chaired by current Prime Minister Theresa May. What needs to come out of that as regards the British response?
Well, it's very difficult. Admiral Lord West came on LBC yesterday to talk to me about this, and he's extremely interesting on it. He doesn't seem to think that there is an effective military response that can be made, but that we should immediately put a convoy system in place with our allies. And I think we then have to look at what sanctions we can impose, what confiscation orders we may be able to impose. But we have to be very clear that we will protect our assets and that we will punish those who attack us. We can't allow this to be brushed under the carpet. And I think therefore...
Did I hear the rattling of sabres there, Jacob?
No, I'm just simply recognising that Donald Trump has got something right, and that perhaps it's because of the... feeling that Mr. Trump's tone isn't one that always goes down well in European circles, that we haven't looked at the underlying virtue of his policy. It's been more about not wanting to be seen to be on the same side as Mr. Trump, rather than thinking about what sort of regime Iran is.
Abby, a response from you to what you've heard from Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, my response would be really is, I would question the wisdom of the fact that the Iranian ship was seized in the Gibraltar's water. We are trying to de-escalate the situation in the Middle East, and by doing that, I don't think it was a wise move. And secondly, Iranians are not going to just do nothing once that thing has happened. So this escalated the things, that we're doing the dirty work for the Americans here. And the United Kingdom shouldn't be really doing the same thing that it happened in the Iraq war. And so my take on it is that the United Kingdom should really stay out of it for,
Well, even though, I'll put you back to Mr. Rees-Mogg, even though a ship has been seized, Abby.
Well, it's only happened now. If you look at it, it's never happened before.
Well, that does.
We have never heard about the British ships to be seized.
Okay, let's bring Mr. Rees-Mogg in. This will be the final point because I must move on.
But
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Abby, that's not quite right. Do you remember a few years ago some Royal Navy personnel were kidnapped by the Iranians and held by them illegally. So Iran is a rogue state. We mustn't delude ourselves about Iran. What we did off Gibraltar was in accordance with EU law that we were following. It was nothing to do with the United States. It was in relation to EU sanctions on Syria, and we were upholding that law where it applied. I think the flaw, obviously, is in commandeering an Iranian ship and then not making preparations to protect British shipping that was in a sphere of influence of Iran.
Do we have enough naval ships to offer? I wonder whether he's one of the Admiral, is one of many military commentators that say we are now dangerously cut back on our military resources.
Look, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on naval matters, but what I've been hearing recently is that since 2005 the cutbacks to the Navy have left us dangerously exposed, and that the costs going on the aircraft carriers have withdrawn resources from the rest of the Royal Navy and therefore have left the UK in a position where it's unable to defend all its assets.
And so do you agree there has to be a check then, a recalibration of spending?
Well, I would be in favour of taking half of the overseas aid budget and giving it to the defence budget on condition that we're sure that the defence budget is spelt well in the first place. I think we need to be clear that there isn't still a good deal of waste in the defence budget, because one certainly hears enough about procurement schemes that aren't ideal, but that we're spending, what is it going to be, £14 billion on overseas aid.
Yes.
If we were to do 0.35% in overseas aid, which would take care of the emergencies, and put the other to defence.
Suddenly found £7 billion.
And you can't spend this money more than once. So I think it relates to our standing in the world, what we're doing in the world. It's a similar type of budget.
And remind me where you are, Mr. Rees-Mogg, as regards HS2. Are you a signed-up fan of that?
No, I'm a signed-up sceptic of HS2.
A lot of money swilling around there, then.
It's a lot of money swilling around there. However, that money, I think, needs to be used for infrastructure projects. I don't think there's a big saving there. I think there may be a reallocation to say, wouldn't it be better to have road building schemes that remove pinch points.
Or rail services in the north.
Or rail services in the north.
Cities, yeah.
Or perhaps managing to do the electrification between Chippenham and Bristol, because you're going to have electrification to Chippenham and then after Bristol. But you're going to have a gap, so you've got to have diesel engines for the trains to do the gap, and that was essentially a cost issue.
Let's move on to other matters. Daniel's in Radlett, and you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Daniel, go ahead. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning. What do you think that Boris should say, if elected, to the EU in terms of negotiation? And if asked, what advice would you give him?
Well, what I would say to the EU is what I would have said in the very beginning. I'd have said we are not the sort of country that treats citizens badly, so anyone who's already here will retain the rights that they've got and will have the same rights as British citizens. And just not bother with the negotiation on that, just say that's what we will do. I would then say they want money and we want a trade deal, and that we will do a deal on that basis. They can have their £39 billion if we have a comprehensive free trade deal coming into effect on the 1st of November. And I think that means every side wins. They get their money so that their budget isn't affected, the Irish economy carries on, because a very large percentage of Irish exports pass through the UK and don't want to be held up at Dover or any of those sorts of things, or have tariffs imposed. And we want a trade deal because we want to continue trading with our nearest neighbours. And I think that would satisfy everybody. It would be a much simpler deal than what's currently being proposed. It doesn't need a backstop. And the only reason we haven't got to that is that the EU, for negotiating purposes, invented a rule to say it couldn't consider the future relationship. There's nothing in Article 50 that stops that.
Let's talk about some of the developments that we've seen as regards the European Union and other key posts. If I'm saying it correctly, Ursula von der Leyen will be the next president, replacing Jean-Claude Juncker. She's had a checkered background as the defence minister in Germany. What do you make of that appointment? Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, the EU never learns, does it?
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's huge democratic discontent with the EU. You saw that. You saw the decline of the vote share for the major parties in the European elections, and you're seeing it in elections across Europe. So what does the EU do? In response to that, it has a classic Franco-German stitch-up, and all the posts get divvied up according to the interests of France and Germany. To federalists. But the ECB goes to a French lady, the Commission goes to a German. It's absolutely classic. It's only the French and the Germans who count. Everyone else is an also-ran, and democracy is for the birds.
What path do you think she might choose for the European Union under her guidance?
Well, she's an arch-federalist. She wants an army. She wants to get rid of vetoes. She wants tax policy to be subject to qualified majority voting. Thank heavens we're leaving. It's their problem, not ours.
The Commission's first Vice President, Frans Timmermans, last week said that they expected Harry Potter-style wizardry from Westminster. Instead, they ended up with Corporal Jones from Dad's Army. Did you recognise that description of David Davis?
Oh, I think that's very unfair on David Davis. I think that...
well, he was our first Brexit. Perhaps it was Dominic Raab.
It wasn't being done by the DEXU Secretary. It was being done by 10 Downing Street, and I think it's unfair on Theresa May.
So Ollie Robbins is Corporal Jones.
I think Ollie Robbins is a cleverer man than that. I think the government did what it wanted to do. I'm afraid I think that we elected a Remainer who didn't really want to leave and negotiated something that looked like remaining in the European Union.
But it was a bit Dad's Army-ish?
I always liked Dad's Army. Modelled myself on Captain Mannering, so who am I to criticise?
All right, model yourself on Captain Mannering. I like that. Okay, we've been talking a lot about your European senior personnel. Let's come back to the United Kingdom, to the UK. Caroline Fairbairn, who's director of the CBI, has given a broadcast and a warning today in which she seeks to say the perils with which this country might be faced unless the incoming Prime Minister was to act decisively. Listen, if you would indulge me. I spoke for about a minute with Caroline Fairbairn earlier this morning. I'd like your interpretation of that.
In terms of the effect on GDP, I think the forecasts that we put together are going to turn out to be broadly right.
Oh,
in
come
terms
along,
of
Caroline.
Where
are the 950,000 jobs? We're at record employment.
One of the things that has happened because of the Brexit uncertainty is that firms have kept on employment.
No.
They have
Where are
kept
the
on
950,000 jobs that have gone?
No, that is absolutely right. But what we have seen is that jobs are... The other thing
you said there would be a 5% hit to GDP, and you and I both know that there hasn't been. I say again, I think you're a jolly decent soul, and your organisation is crucially important, but you can't keep doing these scare stories. You're just wrong.
But the important thing is that we look to the future now, and I think most people would accept that the economy is in the slow lane now as a result of Brexit uncertainty.
And where is the economy in the European Union? Are they in the fast lane?
We have our investment rates are 26% lower than they should be at this stage of the business cycle. This is a concern. Companies are postponing investment because of where we are.
Caroline Fairbairn speaking with me earlier. Now, Mr. Rees-Mogg, while it's fair to say some people joined in and said that I was fairly spot on, others said that in fact there is a desperate day of reckoning awaiting and that people such as Caroline Fairbairn and others are correct. How do you interpret it?
The CBI is always wrong. It was wrong. It opposed Margaret Thatcher's economic reforms in the early 80s. It backed the exchange rate mechanism to the bitter end. It wanted us to join the euro, and it hates us leaving the European Union. It's not about business.
Does it only want the status quo?
Yes, it wants the status quo and backs big business. And it claims 190,000 members. But in those 190,000 members, it includes people who belong to membership organisations that sign up. So it includes all the members of the National Farmers Union and the Country Landowners Association as its members, and that makes up about a third of its membership. It's a humbug organisation, and you exposed that humbug in your interview with Mrs. Fairbairn. Was she Dame Caroline? She's been honoured, hasn't she?
I don't think that is awaiting.
I thought she had been.
We'll check. Yeah. Let's see if she. In which case, I must apologise because I should have afforded her full nomenclature.
But you cut right through to it. That broadcast should be put around everywhere because we get these ridiculous scare stories from a body that some people still respect, and they should realise that not only does it get things wrong, but it doesn't admit that it's got it wrong, and it likes to support oligopoly businesses.
Let's move to other matters while we check on her position. Hassan is in Slough. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning, Hassan.
Good morning, gentlemen. Hi. Jessica, would you condemn Trump's racist tweet against the four congresswomen known as the Squad?
Oh, I think the language he used is not language that one would use in polite discourse.
Is that satisfactory, Hassan? I'm not being rude, but did you want a comeback on that? Because that seems fairly unequivocal.
Yes. I mean, I've called out the Republicans myself. I mean, I am a staunch Conservative. I've been to Parliament before, and I'm a pro-Republican supporter. But I've actually called out the Republicans for their relative silence for what is openly a racist tweet. I mean,
yes.
They've condemned it, but they haven't actually said it's actually racist.
Look, I'm pro-Republican like you. I have some sympathy for Donald Trump. I think he is proving to be a good and effective president, but that doesn't mean I like every tweet that he puts out, and I think his language was, well, obviously not language I would use to put it at it's very unsavoury language. He denies it. He denies it's racist, and
but that still affords you a view, though.
I don't think it is for British politicians to weigh in against the American president, who is our most important relationship.
But it's inflammatory.
It is not language I would use. And it's rather obscured the point that these four ladies are hard left socialists. And that was the essential point that it's worth getting across that the Democratic Party in the US is making Jeremy Corbyn look like a moderate.
Hassan, thank you for that. Jacob Rees-Mogg, why did I ever doubt you? Yes, you're absolutely right, and my apologies if she or any of her colleagues are listening. I should have addressed Caroline Foreman as Dame. That was earlier this year. She's been in the Queen's birthday honours list, a decision I read that was caused a degree of controversy about Brexiteers. We'll park that there, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I think I said something to the Daily Express on the subject.
Well, you're always in the Daily Express. There you are again. In fact, you've reminded me.
I'm in the Sunday Express normally with you.
I know. We look forward
I
to
hope
that.
is widely read by LBC listeners.
We read each other's words with great interest, a keen interest. Here we are. There's a picture of you, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Slash stamp duty urges Jacob Rees-Mogg. It must be slash stamp duty, and also large sections of the Green Belt declassified. This was a piece you wrote, I think, for a different title yesterday. Briefly, what were you saying? This is a Telegraph piece, wasn't it?
It was a Telegraph piece. I've done a report with the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs. If you use 3.9% of the Green Belt in London, you get 1 million new homes. And that's not talking about beautiful parkland or countryside.
Okay,
It's using disused railway sheds that happen to be in the Green Belt and therefore can't have a change of use. The regulations in the Green Belt simply stop anything being brought forward.
So these are like derelict old sheds
they
and
can be
lockups
derelict,
and God knows what else.
That's right, all sorts of rubbish. It's not high-quality land. And that's the key. And you unlock that.
Almost needs to be redesignated, doesn't it? A different
word.
Of
course it does.
Yeah.
And people think that the Green Belt is an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's not. Some of it is just... Next time you fly into Heathrow, just look out of the window, look down, and you will see swathes of areas around London that actually are pretty scruffy. And we're protecting that as if it were St James's Park. And this really isn't the right way to protect
So it's
things.
like scruffy light industrial sort of land, effectively.
That sort of thing.
Okay.
And we need more houses.
And
so that's what I'm arguing is stamp duty.
And a word on stamp duty, sorry.
Stamp duty has been strangling the property market. That what I said in a piece was that it's stopping the young getting on the property ladder because the old can't come down a couple of steps on the property ladder because they can't sell because the stamp duty is so high.
Let's borrow you for an extra minute if we may. Mark and Ross on why. Your final question for now. Mark, go ahead. You're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Mark, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question regarding taking no deal off the table. It's obvious to anyone that by taking no deal off the table, you hand all of the initiative to those you are negotiating with. And that is just so obvious. And I'm wondering, do the MPs that vote in favour of this, are they that stupid that they don't realise it, or are they corrupt and showing a willingness to stay in the EU?
Well, look, I don't think they're either stupid or corrupt. I think they are Machiavellian, that what they really want to do is to stay in the EU, as you rightly say, Mark, and the way they want to do it is by saying we mustn't have no deal, and then voting against, as the Labour Party's consistently done, any deal. Though, to be fair, Philip Hammond and others have voted for Mrs May's deal, but Mrs May's deal wasn't really leaving the European Union. So it's all about avoiding the result of the referendum in 2016. These people put the interests of the European Union ahead of the interests of the United Kingdom, and that is the problem, and no deal has become code for saying remain.
And should they, if they were in positions in the government, should they have been fired if they abstained from last week's vote?
The principle of collective responsibility is extremely important. It's one of our constitutional principles, and nobody should stay in the government who cannot vote with the government. Yes, of course.
They should all have been fired.
Of course they should. That you cannot have different ministers saying different things about government policy. Otherwise, how do you hold them to account?
It's been great getting to know you over these recent months, and I know your love of cricket is absolutely huge in your life. Given that England might have benefited from a rather favourable umpire's call as regards those overruns, should the trophy have been shared between England and New Zealand? I speak, of course, of the one-day international.
Yeah. Look, I wouldn't.
Do you know that you know the umpire?
I know exactly what you're talking about, which was helpfully pointed out by an Australian umpire, which I thought was typical. I think it was so close. It would have been lovely if the trophy had been shared, but I'm jolly pleased we won. I'm not quite nice enough natured in the end to say we should share it.
I don't think the blokes would want it. I think they'd rather fight to the death. Sportsmen normally want
it, and we won, we've got the trophy, it's been in the Times, therefore it's authoritative.
And was your tweet rather ill-judged? We don't need Europe to win.
It was a little joke, but I'm afraid the left get a fit of the vapours and need the smelling salts, whatever one says. So pass the smelling salts, Mildred, I think.
Do you think it'll always be like, did the ball cross the line? You remember Jeff Hurst?
Oh, yeah, that's
it will
right.
Be, won't it? It was Ben Stokes. Was that actually the extra? It's
in
66.
years to come, but we won.
We won. Do I see you again?
I look forward to it in a fortnight.
I hope so. Oh, we're just hearing. Is that right? OK, I've just heard that Alan Duncan has announced that he will be departing the government, I've just been told. If that were the case, I remember, weren't you once with me? Who was it? Somebody quit the European Union or announced they were standing down and you wanted to bide your time to ensure. But if it were the case that Alan Duncan has decided he's no longer up with this, he cannot put, your reaction?
Alan is an absolutely delightful, amusing man, but he loathes Boris Johnson. It was fairly obvious that he couldn't be in a Boris Johnson government, considering what he said about Boris in recent years.
I wish you the best of fortune over the coming days, and I do hope I see you again soon. Jacob Rees-Mogg, appearing here on LBC Where News is Next.
Speaking on LBC, Jacob Rees-Mogg has accused Jeremy Hunt of grandstanding about his future in the government. He says the Tory leadership contender has indicated that he will only serve in the high